welcome to the New York Studio School. This evening I'm very pleased to introduce Richard Hennessy, who studied the history of art at Columbia and the Institute of Fine Arts, and his few occasionally controversial essays have appeared in Art Forum, Art in America, and other venues, while his paintings can also be found in public and private collections around the world, including North America, Mexico, Japan, Italy, France, and in the permanent collections of the Metropolitan, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the San Francisco Museum of Art, and he also has a mural at PS1. Tonight, Richard Hennessy will give a lecture entitled, This Painter's Poussin. Please welcome Richard Hennessy.
Thank you for braving this cold weather. I hail from Rochester, New York, and believe me, this is nothing. It's a poor excuse for winter. I'm going to put up on the wall to get us warmed up. This is a painting that's even further north than Rochester. It's in Toronto in a private collection. And it was done in 1987. It's quite large. It's 7 feet by 9 feet. And I thought the title of it was especially apposite. It's called Those Who Have Torches Will Pass Them to Others. It's in the spirit of that sentiment that I'm giving this lecture. From a very early time in Rochester as a child, I began to feel the cultural pull of New York City. It took many forms. My parents subscribed to Life magazine, and in it, of course, I always look forward to these wonderful spreads on art of the past and the present. New York City's contemporary art life was celebrated. It conveyed to me the notion that New York City was really the place to be, both if you wanted to see old art and the latest thing that was being made. I subscribed as a child to a magazine called the Saturday Review. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's been defunct for quite a while, but it seemed like every other month it had a photograph of the portrait of the forever youthful George Bernard Shaw with his elfin grin looking out at you. It was marvelous. And one of the art critics of the Saturday Review was a man called James Thrall Soby, S-O-B-Y. He was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. He left quite an important collection to the museum. And that was one of my channels to what was going on in New York. There was another woman called Catherine Kuh, K-U-H, who also covered contemporary art. In the Saturday Review, there was an advertisement. One day I noticed from the Harry Abrams Publishing Company. You're not going to believe this, but there were portfolios that the introductory offer was 25 cents for the first one, but you had to agree to buy 6, and they each cost $1.25 plus postage. I still have 2 of them. One is Van Gogh. It was written by Meyer Shapiro. Across from each illustration was a short text of analysis and historical background. It began with a long essay. The other one I still have was written by Julius Held, no less, on Flemish painting. Again, the same format. I treasure these books and, of course, devour the images. I can't say at the age of 14 or 15 I really completely appreciated the text, but at least I can say I was reading Meyer Shapiro at that age. With how much comprehension, I can't really say. I also, and I've never been able to figure this out, had a subscription to the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. How I ever heard about this, I can't imagine. It's about as professional and level discussion of these things, imaginable, very scholarly. But it was my reading matter. My parents got the Sunday New York Times, and that also was a great source of information. I loved reading about the theater. I remember one day I engaged in a very magical act. I addressed 6 envelopes to various theaters, requesting tickets, put inside self-addressed stamped envelopes. I walked to the mailbox. I opened it. I put the letters in. I lifted up the red flag. I shut the mailbox. I stood there for a moment and realized, no, I wasn't going to New York. I put the red flag back down. I opened the box. I took the letters back out. But you know, I didn't feel defeated. I felt that I had done maybe about 25% of what needed to be done. In the fullness of time, the rest of it would get done. I went to downtown Rochester on every Saturday. My first great artistic love was music, the piano. And we had a neighbor who had a piano, and they couldn't get me out of the house. They couldn't get me away from it. I was about 6 or 7, and finally, in order to get rid of me, they sold the piano to my parents. And that was the beginning. And then, in the fullness of time, I applied for a scholarship to the Eastman School of Music, and they accepted me. My teacher later said, well, you know, the other teacher said, but there are so many wrong notes. But he thought I had something. At any rate, I was very grateful for that. It meant that every Saturday I went downtown. I could do that as a youngster because at that time in Rochester there was a bus service. I wasn't dependent upon my parents to drive me there. I had a theory lesson at 10, my piano lesson at 11, and then at 12 my teacher would take me out to lunch to a place called the Manhattan. So that was ripe with portent. The school itself was an absolute marvel. I can't tell you how luxurious it is. Of course, it was George Eastman, who founded Eastman Kodak Company, was a great lover of music. The school was attached to the concert hall, which is of a splendor that is absolutely mind-boggling. It's one of the great theaters in this country. When you walk into the Eastman School of Music, we walked into a great 2-story high hall with a magnificent staircase at the end of it. To the right was the Eastman School, and to the left were doors which went directly into the concert hall. This hall was the promenade hall for when there were intermissions. Having this, being exposed to this building, this magnificence, it was designed by McKim, Mead, and White, and it wasn't in their rather frigid style. It was very warm. It was built in 1921. No expense was spared, and a child absorbs without even understanding that art is a terribly important thing. There's no separation between art and life. This was absolutely a part of life. When I was downtown on Saturday, I would also wander over to the public library, which again was magnificent. And what I still recall, their extraordinary generosity. They loaned LPs and beautiful art books to this little kid, and of course I took them home. I'm a product of a very modest kind of technological advances. First of all, the long playing record. It's hard to think back to a time before that, but there was one. And the Skira art book. I remember reading in the paper at the time long discussions about how they were all much too brightly colored, and I suppose my taste was profoundly corrupted by all those bright colors. You get to make up your mind about all of that later. But it was wonderful. I could take out books on 20th century art and Picasso, all kinds of opera recordings. My mother, after she died, we looked through her papers, and to my utter amazement, I discovered that she had saved 2 of my scholarly efforts, high school scholarly efforts, one called Modern Painting, and the other called Existentialism. And and I have the bibliography. The bibliographies are in the back, and all those books came out of the public library. At any rate, in the fullness of time, I did in fact make it to New York City. I was so determined that that's where I wanted to be. I had a tremendous thirst for knowledge, that Columbia was the only school I applied to. Thank God they accepted me, and they gave me a scholarship, which made it all possible. When I got there, of course, there was Meyer Shapiro. There was Julius Held. There also was Rudolf Wittkover, the great humanist architectural historian. I took all three of their graduate courses. Held had a graduate course in Rubens, a great and enduring love of mine. Wittkover had a course on Palladio, and the most famous course of all at Columbia was Shapiro's Impressionism. I cannot tell you what that man was like. The radiance and the enthusiasm and the erudition and flow of talk was extraordinary. In this Impressionism course, we saw not one slide, and he stood before us and without any notes and gave a complete history of the 19th century, science, philosophy, literature. It was a reading list for a lifetime, and I'll never forget him. Many years later, I got to know Richard Wollheim, the great philosopher and art historian. He told me a wonderful story about Shapiro. He said that Wollheim had visited a monastery in Spain, and he had been preceded there by Shapiro. Well, the monastery was absolutely agog and all abuzz. They couldn't get over him. They had been so deeply impressed by the man. And one of the monks came up to Wollheim and said, "You know, now we know what St. Paul was like." I had another wonderful teacher at Columbia, Howard McParland Davis, who was the head of the undergraduate art history department. We all had to take a first-year course in the fine arts, and he had an absolutely unique way of teaching it. He showed nothing but Last Suppers in the first semester, so that this was wonderful, of course, through time. And this taught me that subject matter is never to be confused with content. The subject matter was always the same, but the content changed, of course, the poetic content, and it all arose from artistic treatment of the subject. The very last day, he would cover all the remaining part of the course in a 7-hour lecture that everybody absolutely loved. And in the second semester, we had nothing but Giotto, who was his specialty. So that was all a wonderful introduction. I was not a big man on campus. In my second year, I got permission to have an apartment off campus. My roommate was Scott Burton, who was 2 years older than me and 1 year ahead of me, and about 1,000 years more sophisticated than I was. Scott took me to my first commercial art gallery, and I'll never forget it. It was the Sam Coots Gallery. There was a show of Hans Hofmann. It could have happened this morning. I can still see that smear of Viridian paint. It was absolutely thrilling. And of course, the commercial art gallery scene has been one of the great cultural things in the city. That's where I was able to go and see what was happening in the present. In my junior year, I got the apartment that I'm still living in. And 7 years later, I got the other one. I live on the 5th floor of a tenement. I live in one apartment. It's a railroad flat, and I work in the other. What is so remarkable about this place, and why I'm talking about it, is my view, which is absolutely extraordinary. I look out on the East River at Hellgate, which is where the East River meets the Harlem. It's carved out an enormous basin, and of course that's where you see the Triborough Bridge. And there's no ugly day when you look at you're looking out at water and clouds. And I've been able to paint in natural light all these years. I've had the challenge of that view, and I think it's had an enormous influence on my work. And in fact, as I say to people, I'd be somebody else if I had been looking at a wall all these years. Now, when I got to the Institute of Fine Arts, again, there were these people who had practically invented the subject of art history. Panofsky wasn't teaching there, but at least I did hear him once when he gave a guest lecture. Walter Friedlander was there, very ancient. I would sit reading in the Baroque library, and it would take him about 20 minutes. His office was in the corner. It would take him about 20 minutes to cross the room, and he had all his graduate students helping him while I was very carefully fixing my eyes on the book. I could hear this slow shuffling. He's a man who pioneered Caravaggio studies and got the study of mannerism going. I took a course with Krautheimer, the great German architectural historian, early basilicas of Rome, H.W. Jansen, you know, all of you, the one who wrote the book. I was in his Donatello seminar. And also there was Charles Stirling. Now, it's hard to believe that there was ever a time when there wasn't a book about still lifes. But the fact is, Charles Stirling wrote the first book on still life. And he had been the curator of painting at the Louvre when there was the first retrospective of Poussin. So now you all know what this is. I was absolutely agog the first time I laid my eyes on this painting. I had never heard of Poussin. I was probably 18. And it wasn't particularly my taste. Rubens, Tiepolo, El Greco, that sort of thing. That was what I most naturally gravitated to. But this really flabbergasted me. It's this combination of intricacy and complexity with clarity. You usually don't think of those things as going together. And also the radiance. The vehemence, the energy, all the stretching and straining at the same time, and turbulence, but the quiet, this frozen quality. I studied this painting a great deal. Of course, this gem-like color. I studied this painting at great length and finally thought I had discovered something of interest. And I had the catalog for the 1960 retrospective that took place at the Louvre, and I began looking for what I had found in this painting, and indeed found it in others. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is a small group of paintings which I call emblem and ground plan. And when I submitted my notions in written form to Professor Stirling, he said, well, Richard, you know, you make him sound like a chess master. Now, this didn't sound totally approving to me. Merely seemed to be hovering somewhere in the distance. But, you know, Poussin was a very resolute painter, and he worked with shadow boxes that he constructed, and he made wax dolls that he wrapped in clothing, and he would put them in this box and study the light effects. So I don't think there's, you know, when it comes to calculation, Poussin must have been one of the most calculating who has ever lived. Now let me show you what I discovered. I think that because I was also very involved in contemporary art, I was much more willing to see surface pattern and see everything as lying on the surface. Now, you see this sword? Way in the distance, you see there's another sword. And there is another sword. You see they form the sides of a triangle. Now, we have a triangular thing here, but it gets better. If you see the disposition of forms in space, follow them, you have a triangle. Now, there's a Rape of the Sabines in the Louvre. I'm saving that for later to discuss. because I think I have a suggestion to make about the date. And we need a little momentum, a few more examples of this sort of thing going on. The question, the point I will make is that when this kind of order emerges, it's often the second painting, it's the second treatment of the subject. This sort of thing wouldn't occur to you right from the beginning. Now, I was warned by a very gifted lecturer, no black and white slides. They'll fall asleep. I promise you, this is the only one. Now, this is at the Louvre. It's called Camillus and the Valerian Schoolmaster. Maybe this should be hung in every schoolroom in America, I don't know. But the Valerian Schoolmaster right there, that's the town of Valerii back there. The Romans were on the march and besieging the town. The school teacher decided he saw which way the wind blew and wanted to curry favor with the Romans. He led his students to Camillus as hostages. Well, Camillus was outraged. He thought this was very disgusting. He had the teacher stripped, and he told the students to beat him back to the town, of course, and then the townsmen, they realized, oh, the Romans are so wonderful, they gave up. But this is really fascinating. There's an earlier version of this in the Norton Simon out in Pasadena. It has all of this, but there's an extra, this figure right here is over here, and there's an extra figure here, and you don't have anything like this clarity here. This building, for instance, goes much further over here. This standard, you see there's standard bearers, you see this hand, that would be where the general is, was over here, and it's turned obliquely, so you don't notice it. This eagle is in the center. What we've got here, look at this. Here's the hand, flat on the surface of the painting. Here's the hand, and look, follow the feet. A circle in space. Pretty neat, wouldn't you say? That's how this man's mind worked. This is a wonderful painting. We know there was an earlier example of this. It's been lost. There is a drawing, not by Poussin, but by someone else. Again, it exhibits the same, the earlier one. It's much more diffuse. You don't have this concentration. However, this has probably been lopped off at the top. The earlier, you see back here, there are flames. The temple, this is the temple at Jerusalem. This is Titus. This is the destruction and plundering of the temple. And in the earlier one, you can see the roof and you can see the flame shooting up. If you see Titus, he's looking up there. These men are looking up there. Many of Poussin's paintings have been terribly mishandled, cropped, dreadfully cropped, or added onto. It's something you have to be constantly alert to. You could be saying to yourself, oh, this is so perfectly composed, and then find out that 9 inches has been lopped off the top of it. But anyway, here we go. Look at this. This is a shield with the imperial eagle on it. You see how its wings are spread out? Can you make that out? It imitates the pose you see of Titus, whose arms are spread out. Now, you work out this group, and they're in an oval. Now, over here, you can see the standards. The one with the hand is over here. It's turned. You can hardly make it out. But this is, it's a really amazing thing. And the earlier one has nothing like this clarity. Now here's the Louvre Rape of the Sabines. Degas did a copy of it. I'm sure you've seen many of the wonderful pastiche that Picasso did based on this painting late in life. I would hazard the suggestion, well, in the catalog of the 1995 show at the Louvre of Poussin, the authors said that there was a general consensus that this was the later one. Knowing what we know, what we think we know about the ones that I've shown you, I would guess that this is more apt to be the earlier one, because The second ones tend to be more concise, and an order emerges, which isn't in the earlier one. I think the panhandling, too, is definitely earlier. This is one of the great Poussins. This came to New York. It's in Dresden. Do you remember the show of art from Dresden? This is the realm of flora. It could just be as easily be called the origin of flowers. All of these paintings I've shown you, it came from the 1630s. This was when Poussin was in his the late 30s, early 40s, at the very height of his powers. Here you see Ajax falling on his sword, and the carnation is there. There you see sunflowers. You see this woman, she's looking at the sun god Apollo. This is Narcissus. You see he's looking at himself in reflection in this bowl. There is Hyacinth. He's feeling the wound on his head. He's holding a hyacinth. There's Crocus. At any rate, there is Flora, and you see that circle that Apollo is heading through, and all of these figures arranged in a circle with the lovely Flora in the middle. We know that Poussin studied the Greco-Roman sculpture, and what is amazing about this is that this doesn't look like a garden of statuary. This is really just about the hardest thing you can possibly do. All of these isolated figures, and yet they don't seem disconnected. He's been able to weave it all together. It's the command of the intervals, of course. They're never awkward. They're shapely. But also it's this unbelievably beautiful blonde light which suffuses the painting. I'll get into his history a little bit. I just want to familiarize yourself with the idiom, and then we can go into it a little more deeply. Now, this is one of the glories of the Philadelphia Museum, and in the first catalog of 1960, the first show, this was called The Triumph of Aphrodite. In the second show in 1995, it's called The Triumph of Venus. Very learned arguments. I have no opinion. I'm not qualified. Whenever I read one of these discussions, I'm swayed by whatever I happen to be reading. Now, this is not quite as neat a case as the others. It's more a question of rhyming. And I would point out this, which echoes or rhymes with the grouping of the figures. Again, this wonderful sense of bustle, of movement. They're just landing on the beach, but it's all stopped. It's frozen. But I think one of the things that gives this painting the energy and push that it has, look at this cloud. See how that's come rushing up and pushing all these figures forward. I want to point out there is little Cupid bringing up the rear. He's in his chariot. The chariot is being pulled by doves. How's that for a charming touch? Look at these wonderful bodies. And Callipygus charms of this woman, a spécialité of Monsieur Poussin, these beautiful athletic people, all glorious in the sun. Keep this in mind, this wonderful pagan side of Poussin, and because we'll need to think about that later. Now, we're going back. Poussin was born in 1594. He found his way to Paris at the age of 18, and studied painting and had his little successes, but somehow he knew that he had to get to Rome. And it was only on the third attempt that he made it. We know that at one point he got as far as Lyon. He was dragged back to Paris by the police. He had skipped out on his landlord's bill. The second time he got as far as Florence. And then